everyone. Welcome back to After Dark. This is your host, Laura B. This is the sixth and final episode of the Casey Anthony series. Next week, I will start covering Tanner Barton's case, which will probably be two parts. After we are done with that, we will have an episode of an interview I conduct with Michelle Barton, Tanner's mom. She will share with you all of the obstacles families go through when they lose a loved one and the fight they have to put up to get justice. Michelle Barton is a mama bear that won't back down. You can check her out and follow her journey on Facebook at Tanner's Voice. Now let's jump into today's episode. Last week we left off with Casey getting bonded out of jail by a bounty hunter who thought he could get Casey to tell him the truth. When he found out he couldn't, he left, only $50,000 poorer. It wasn't long, though, before Casey was back in jail after her friend Amy Huizinga filed check fraud charges against her for the several shopping sprees she took on Amy's dime while Amy was in Costa Rica. In October 2008, the prosecutor took the case against Casey to the grand jury, and 2 hours later she was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information. The first-degree murder charge was because even though they hadn't found Caylee yet, the evidence they had made them think that Caylee was no longer alive. Here is a statement from the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Quote, FBI lab tests, along with additional evidence that had not been made public, leads investigators to the belief that there is a strong probability that Caylee Anthony is deceased. End quote. Casey pleaded not guilty. On December 11, 2008, Roy Crunk was back in the same area of Hope Spring Drive and Suburban Avenue. He went into the woods and saw that the bag and white object were still there. In case you don't remember, Roy Crunk had been at that spot in August 2 different times and had called the police to come and check out the bag he had found, and first time they didn't show. The second time they didn't want to go into the muddy woods. So he found it still there in December. Here is a quote from Roy Crunk. I was standing behind it, so I was looking at it from behind, and I still didn't think it was real. So I very gently took a stick and put it into the right eye socket, and I gently pivoted up and I looked down, and I realized what it was. And I set it down as gently as I could and went up and called my area supervisor. End quote. Roy wasn't going to let it go this time. He called Orange County Sheriff and asked for an officer to meet him. They did, and he led them into the woods where the skull and the bag were. Later, Orange County spokesperson Carlos Padilla announced they had found the skull of a young child. In prosecutor Jeff Ashton's book, Imperfect Justice, he said this about finding the remains. The remains had clearly been in that location for a long time. It would have been very difficult to get into the swamp, let alone see something in there, underwater, in very dark conditions. There was a little gap in the air curtain, and ironically, there was a discarded yellow sign with black lettering for a daycare center at that opening. But that was the only access point to the woods. You could have walked 5 feet to the left or right and never seen it. But once the vines and overhanging vegetation were pulled back, the whole gruesome picture became disturbingly clear. End quote. They were found at Hope Spring Drive and Suburban Road, about 20 feet from the road. The skull still had hair and duct tape on it. The rest of the bones were found within a 30-foot radius. Crime scene investigators spent 11 days looking for all of the little bones that were scattered. The bones had bite and scratch marks from animals on them. The remains had been wrapped in a Winnie the Pooh blanket, put inside a canvas laundry bag, and 2 garbage bags. This area was said to have been searched before, but during June and July, it was under several feet of water. 1 hour after the remains were found, they brought Casey to the chaplain to tell her and watch her reaction. While she was in the waiting room, a news report came on the TV about the remains that were found. They hadn't even confirmed they were for sure Caylee'S, but Casey put her head down and began to cry. The remains were sent to the lab, and during a press conference, it was announced that they were the remains of little Caylee Marie Anthony. They found that the Winnie the Pooh blanket that Caylee had been wrapped in came from the Winnie the Pooh bed set in her bedroom at the Anthonys. The canvas laundry bag that she was found in came from a set of 2. The other one was found at the Anthony house. Also, the garbage bags that she was in matched a roll found at the Anthonys. The most compelling piece of evidence was a piece of duct tape that was holding the mandible in place on the skull. It was still in the hair also. The forensics team said it had been wrapped around Caylee's head 3 times and would have covered her nose and mouth. The duct tape was the same brand as a piece of duct tape found on a gas can in the Anthony shed. Because there is no reason a piece of duct tape should be wrapped around a child's face, this was automatically called a homicide by a medical examiner. It was time for Casey and Jose Baez to face the charges that Casey had against her. Months leading up to the trial, the prosecution found Baez's tactics to be unethical and unprofessional, especially when it came to him talking to the media. In Jeff Ashton's book, he talked about how Baez was, quote, slick and didn't shoot straight, end quote. The prosecution tried to get a gag order to stop Baez from talking to the media, but it was denied. The prosecution also found out about the deal Casey and Baez made with ABC about selling Caylee's pictures. They were worried that they might try to sell the crime scene photos and pictures of Caylee's remains. The judge granted a motion that they wouldn't be seen until the trial. Jeff Ashton also commented on the deal with ABC. He said, quote, I was so disgusted with her at that moment. At the time when the sale had taken place, I was confident that Caylee was already dead and that Casey knew it. What kind of mother would sell pictures of her dead child for a profit? End quote. Casey's trial was scheduled to start in May 2011. In April of 2010, Baez filed a motion to have the court-appointed judge, Judge Strickland, removed from the trial. Baez said he had a prejudice against Casey. Apparently, on October 19th, after a hearing, Judge Strickland was talking to a man who was running an anti-Casey Anthony blog. The judge made the comment, quote, it appears the truth and Miss Anthony are strangers, end quote. Judge Strickland had actually been very fair to the defense. He had denied quite a few motions filed by the prosecution, but he was replaced. However, he made sure to take a dig at Jose Baez on his way out. He said, quote, at its core, defense counsel's motion accuses the undersigned of being a self-aggrandizing media hound. Indeed, the irony is rich, end quote. The judge who replaced Strickland was Judge Belvin Perry Jr. The prosecution was actually very happy about this move. However, Baez kept making things difficult for everyone and made sure to take his time on time-sensitive things. He made pretrial hearings a lot longer than they needed to be. In one instance, he gave the prosecution a list of experts that were going to testify on the defense's behalf, but he didn't include what each expert was testifying about. He also would deliver things late to the prosecution and say he forgot. He wanted to keep the prosecution in the dark about his tactics for as long as possible. He wanted to take them and the judge and the jury by surprise, and that is exactly what he did. In March of 2011, there were 3 days of Fry hearings. This is a judicial test that makes sure all the forensic evidence and the experts' techniques are accepted by the scientific community. It is also called the Fry Standard. Baez was hoping to get a lot of the evidence thrown out during this hearing. They first went over the report of Arpad Voss's air sample compound test. This would be the first time that the smell of a decomposing body would be presented as evidence. The decompositional odor was allowed, even though the defense brought in 2 scientists that said Dr. Voss's methods were not generally accepted. The method used to test the carpet samples was also allowed, since it had been used for over 40 years and was accepted by the scientific community. So far, it wasn't looking good for Casey and Baez. Next, he tried to get any mention of chloroform omitted from the trial. The judge found there was evidence Casey had access to the computer at the time chloroform was searched. Therefore, he allowed the evidence in. Baez was pissed. His plan wasn't working, so he needed to come up with something else, and boy, did he ever. Next, Baez put in for a change of venue. The judge denied this also. I bet he was wishing at that point he would have kept Judge Strickland. He did, however, agree that the jurors could be picked from the Clearwater and St. Petersburg area, which was about 90 minutes from Orlando. It took 3 weeks for jury selection. Baez wanted to avoid women on the jury, especially young mothers. He was trying for males around the age of 45. He seemed to think they would have more sympathy for Casey, or knowing Baez, lust for Casey. They ended up with a very diverse jury made of 12 jurors and 5 alternates, most of which supported the death penalty. The prosecution called George and Cindy in for a meeting a few days before the trial was to start. He had some news that they didn't want to have to tell them, but he wanted them to be prepared for when they heard it in the courtroom. Baez was going with a story that included George molesting Casey and Caylee drowning in their swimming pool, and George covering it. George's response was, quote, I just want you to know none of this is true. He also said Caylee drowning in the pool was a bullshit story. On May 22, 2011, 2 days before the trial, George met with Jeff Ashton. He said he knew Casey had done something with Caylee, but he didn't know what. He said the case had been about Casey for too long and Caylee had gotten lost in the mix. May 24th, 2011 was the first day of the trial of the state of Florida versus Casey Marie Anthony. The prosecution started with their opening statements, which were all about Caylee. Linda Burdick said Casey and Caylee left the home on Hope Spring Drive at 12:50 p.m. on the afternoon of June 16, 2008, and no one ever saw Caylee alive again. A quote from Burdick states, quote, Caylee's death allowed Casey Anthony to live the good life, at least for those 31 days, end quote. Next, we have Baez's open statement. How could a mother go 31 days without reporting her child missing? The answer is simple. She was never missing. She died on June 16, 2008, when she drowned in the family pool. This is the story the defense told. You're going to hear that Caylee loved to swim, and Caylee could get out of the house very easily, and did so on that day. We hear about it every day, or once a week, or once every other week. We hear a story on the news, or we'll see a little blurb in the newspaper about some poor child that accidentally drowned in the swimming pool. In the state of Florida, the number one way children die is by drowning in swimming pools. You will hear stories about a family that is incredibly dysfunctional. You will hear about ugly things, secret things that people don't speak about, things that Casey never spoke about. On June 16, 2008, after Caylee died, Casey did what she's been doing all her life, or for most of it, hiding her pain, going into that dark corner and pretending that she does not live in the situation that she's living. She went back to that deep, ugly place called denial, to pretend as if nothing was wrong. And you'll see as the evidence comes in that this is the most logical solution of the evidence. Something's not right here. Something's not right with this girl. Jose told the jury it all started when Casey was 8 years old and George came into her room. Psychiatrists Danziger and Weitz were on the witness list for the defense. Casey had told them that George had molested her from the age of 8 until her early teens. She said her brother Lee had come in her room once and touched her breast. When it woke her, he stood there staring. So the psychiatrists were going to testify that Casey had been molested. Here is what Bias said happened on the 16th of June in 2008. That morning, Casey slept till 9 a.m. She woke up to George in her room yelling, "Where's Caylee?" After searching everywhere in the house, George went to the backyard, and that's when he found her. She was floating in the pool. George pulled her out, but it was too late. She was gone. He walked up to the house holding Caylee, limp and wet. He started screaming at Casey that it was all her fault. Casey turned around and ran to her room, and she says that's the last time that she saw Caylee. I've got so many questions. Number one, how is it that according to phone records that we went over in a previous episode, Casey was up bright and early that morning around 7 a.m. on her computer and texting people? There's no way she was asleep until 9 a.m. Number two, why would she run to her room and stay there? Why would she not try to resuscitate her daughter? How did she know she was even dead at that moment? Wouldn't you try everything to save your child and not just run to your room like a child yourself? Casey had told Dr. Danziger she didn't think Caylee drowned in the pool by accident. She thought George may have been molesting Caylee and killed her so she wouldn't say anything. How dare this girl? Her parents may not have been the greatest, and it's apparent their parenting skills are lacking and that they raised the monster Casey turned out to be. But they have continuously stood by her, even when they were positive she had done something to Caylee. But Casey, once again, only thinking about herself, continues with her lies, and this time brings her dad into it and says he did something unfathomable. Casey is disgusting. Also, Dr. Danziger admits that in his first interview with Casey, when he asked if she had ever been molested, she had told him no. Casey also said she had told her mom about Lee coming into her room that one time, and she called Casey a whore. Why would she tell her about the one incident with Lee, but not about the years of supposed abuse by George? Jose Bias was throwing shit and hoping something would stick. He even had the audacity to accuse Roy Crunk, the man who found Caylee's remains, of putting the tape over her face when he found her. If it wasn't for Roy, little Caylee would probably never have been found. How dare Jose Bias for tarnishing an innocent man's name? The prosecution first called George Anthony to the stand. He never changed his story at all. Jeff Ashton asked George if Caylee had drowned and if he disposed of her body. George started to get upset and cry. He said never. The whole time he is sitting over there rolling her eyes and shaking her head. George also adamantly denied molesting Casey also. On the second day of trial, Tony Lazaro was called to the stand. He was Casey's boyfriend of 2 months at the time Caylee went missing. He says that Casey had told him she had been molested when she was younger. He said she told him this around the 30th of June in 2008. She never said it was George who molested her, however. He said she did tell him that George had hit her. The judge ruled this last part as hearsay and wouldn't allow the jury to hear it. On day 4 of the trial, George is confronted with a lie he had told. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree in this family. The authorities had questioned George about the duct tape on the gas can. He originally told them that it was 3 years ago that he had put it there. Authorities, however, found the same tape was used to hang missing persons flyers of Caylee. George admitted he put the tape on the can on the 24th of June in 2008 because when Casey brought the cans back after she had stole them, there was a piece missing off of one of them. On May 28th, day 5 of the trial, Cindy was called to the stand. She said Casey had been talking about Zanny the nanny since 2006. She was still making excuses for Casey. Here is what Jeff Ashton said about Cindy's time on the stand in his book, Imperfect Justice, Prosecuting Casey Anthony. Quote, during cross-examination, Cindy's ambivalence that we'd been witnessing for the last 3 years came roaring back. She spent some time painting an idealistic picture of Casey as a mother. And even when talking about why she thought Casey's long-term lies were so elaborate and detailed, she couldn't help but excuse Casey. To her, the scope and intricity of the lies implied that they were illusions, not lies. Cindy equated them to a situation where children create imaginary people. Once again, Cindy seemed to be whitewashing every bad behavior her daughter demonstrated. The codependency between Cindy and her daughter was striking. She was finding it impossible to make Casey accountable for anything. End quote. Cindy didn't stop there with defending Casey. She tried to take the blame for the chloroform search also. She said she was looking up chlorophyll because the bamboo roots were making her dog sick. She said she must have accidentally typed in the word chloroform. Nice try, Cindy, but I'm not buying it. Next, Detective Yuri Melik took the stand. Baez asked why they never asked Casey about the swimming pool in the Anthony's backyard. Yuri said they did ask her right after their little excursion to Universal Studios. Casey still said it was the nanny at that time. They talked about the coffin flies that were found in the trunk were the same as were at the place where Caylee'S remains were found. They went over the hair strands that were found in the trunk that had death banding in them. The jury seen the air samples of Dr. Voss, which had been sealed since 2008, yet still had a strong odor of decomposition. Dr. Jan Garavaglia, I'm sorry if I can't pronounce all these names, talked about the duct tape found on the skull and hair. She said, quote, "There is no child that should have duct tape on its face when it dies. There is no reason to put duct tape on the face after they die." End quote. One of the most compelling and heartbreaking pieces of evidence was given by Dr. Michael Warren, who was head of the Human Identification Lab. He took 3 photos of Caylee. They were on a TV screen and were on top of one another. One was a picture of Caylee, alive, happy, and healthy. The last was a picture of her skull. The piece of duct tape was in place to show that her mouth and nose both would have been covered with the tape. The prosecution told the jury what they thought had happened to Caylee. They said there was a lot of conflict between Casey and Cindy. Casey found it easier to lie to get what she wanted, for example, about having a job. She then had to steal to cover those lies because if she didn't have money once in a while, people might stop believing she had a job. Her parents thought she was working during the day, when in reality, she was running around to different friends' houses the whole time with Caylee in tow, dragging her from one place to the next. At night, she wanted to go out and get a break from Caylee, but her mom would get mad. As she thought that Casey was at work all day, she would tell Casey she needed to stay home in the evenings and spend time with her daughter. So Casey had Caylee with her 24/7, but she couldn't tell her parents the truth of not having a job, so she felt stuck. Everything was okay when Casey met Ricardo. He was like a father figure to Caylee and a homebody. Caylee fit into the scenario. Casey and Caylee would hang out at Ricardo's, and it was like they were a little family. Then Casey met Tony Lazaro, who was the complete opposite of Ricardo. Tony told Casey that he didn't want kids, and if he did have them, that he wanted boys. Not that he could decide that. But here's a statement from Jeff Ashton. "I imagine Casey told herself some lie to rationalize that murdering her baby was the best for Caylee. Maybe she told herself that she didn't want Caylee to grow up with Cindy as she had. Or maybe she knew that it wouldn't be long before Caylee began to talk, and once that happened, the made-up babysitter, the fake job, the whole world would come crashing down. When you are good at lying to other people, you get really good at lying to yourself." End quote. Jeff Ashton believed that Casey used chloroform to put Caylee to sleep. Then she applied the duct tape over her mouth and wrapped it around her head 3 times. She then wrapped her in a blanket from her room and put her in the trunk of her car to die. After that, she drove around and called some people, went to Blockbuster with Tony. She spent the night at his apartment, all while her daughter was left to suffocate outside in the trunk of her car. The next day, she called George to make sure he was at work before she came by the house. When she got to the house, she grabbed the laundry bag and garbage bags and attempted to bury Caylee in the backyard. But the shed was locked, so she had to borrow a shovel from the neighbor. She put Caylee's body on the grass as she began to dig a hole. That's why the cadaver dogs indicated to the area in the backyard near the playhouse. Casey found out it was too much work to dig a hole that deep, so she put Caylee back in the trunk and returned the shovel. She then drove less than a mile down the road, walked into the woods 20 feet, and left Caylee on the ground. After a 6-week-long trial on June 5th, 2011, the jury deliberated for only 10 hours and 40 minutes and came back with the surprising verdict of not guilty on all counts, except for lying to the police. On July 17th, Casey was released on time served, and she was free to live her life however she wanted. Jeff Ashton felt that the jury wasn't paying attention during most of the trial. While deliberating, they never asked questions about any of the evidence or any of the testimony. They did, however, ask for movies and food. One jury released a statement after the trial. It said, quote, "Generally, none of us liked Casey Anthony at all. She seems like a horrible person. But the prosecutors did not give us enough evidence to convict. They gave us a lot of stuff that makes us think she probably did something wrong, but not beyond a reasonable doubt." End quote. The same juror, a decade later, had different feelings by then. They said in another statement, quote, "I think of the case at least once a day, every single day. My decision haunts me to this day. I think now if I were to do it over again, I'd push harder to convict her of one of the lesser charges, like aggravated manslaughter. At least that, or child abuse. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I didn't stand up for what I believed in at the time." End quote. No matter the feelings of the jurors now, Casey can never be charged again for the death of Caylee because of the double jeopardy law. Casey still lives in Florida. She works for the PI that worked on her case, Pat McKenna. She lived with him and his family for quite a while after being released. She has little to no contact with Cindy and George. She talks to her brother Lee every once in a while. In June 2019, she was supposedly working on a movie about Caylee's death called As I Was Told. That came to a halt when the pandemic hit. She did, however, release a documentary on Peacock at the beginning of this year called Where the Truth Lies. It was a complete waste of time. She blamed everything on George and still didn't tell what happened to Caylee. She still took no responsibility. Casey Anthony is nothing but a narcissistic monster, and Caylee deserved a better mother and a better life. She deserved to grow up and go to prom, graduate high school, and go to college, to get married and have kids of her own. She never got that chance because the person who was supposed to protect her and be there as she grew turned out to be the very monster that nightmares are made of. You can follow me on After Dark's Facebook and Instagram for pictures from this case. If you would like to request a case, you can message me on the Facebook page or on Instagram. Next week, we will be talking about Tanner Barton. Until then, be safe and take care. Bye.